welcome to our Centro Norteamericano mini course of English. This is for HR directors and team leaders. My name is Terry, and today I'm going to be talking to you about how you can conduct successful interviews in English and really get to understand how competent your potential employee's level of English is. Because let's be honest, a level of English is more than just a number and a letter on a CV. Sounds good? Let's get to it. So, we know that it's a given that people on their CVs will often embellish, maybe highlight certain things that aren't 100% true, and the level of English is usually one of those things. But this doesn't just apply to the candidate. This could also be applying to you. Ask yourself this question. Have you ever been in an interview situation where maybe the candidate's given you an answer that you're not able to respond to? Do you have a solid structure for how you interview somebody in English? Do you have a system? Do you have specific questions? What do you do if you become lost for words? Well, hopefully in this first part, we're going to talk about structuring the interview. So you go into that room fully prepared for any eventuality. So let's begin. Starting with the structuring of the interview in English. I can safely assume that you already know the basics of conducting interviews, but when we're doing it in English, it helps to follow a specific structure. This ensures that you sound natural and in control. We're going to focus on 3 stages: starting, transitioning, and then wrapping things up. Okay, so let's kick things off with starting the interview. We should be focusing on setting the right tone, professional, but also inviting. Here's a useful phrase you can use to begin. Thanks for joining us today. Could you start by telling me a little bit about yourself and your career background? Why does this work as an opening question? Well, it relaxes the interviewee and gets them talking about something that they already know themselves. Plus, it offers you a chance to observe their fluency right from the start. Now let's look at transitioning to key questions. We want to try and create smooth transitions. How do we move from the introduction onto actually testing their skills? Here's another useful phrase. Let's talk about your previous role. Could you tell me how you managed project? This encourages them to explain processes clearly in English and also demonstrates their ability to describe real-world work scenarios. And finally, let's talk about wrapping up. How do you end the interview while keeping it professional? Here's a clear, respectful closing phrase that you can use. Thanks for your time today. We'll get back to you with the next steps shortly. This gives a polite, professional impression and wraps everything up nicely and cleanly. Now, here's the tricky part. How do you actually know if a candidate's English is really as good as it appears, or if they're just using rehearsed and practiced lines? Maybe they've been standing in front of the mirror. Maybe they've been to several interviews and have lots of chances to practice. As a Cambridge examiner myself, I've been trained to spot English proficiency. It's what I do for a living, and it's what I've been doing for nearly 20 years. However, this isn't your principal job. So what I'm going to do is give you my list of red flags that you can look out for so that you can distinguish between genuine, real answers and rehearsed, practiced. Being able to spot red flags that indicate that someone might be faking fluency or just rehearsing answers is a really valuable skill to have when interviewing. So let's look at overly short responses. Listen to this example question and the response. What's wrong with the response? Tell me about the time you used English in your last job.
Yes, every day.
As we can see, this is not exactly what we were looking for, was it? If they just barely answer the question, that could mean that they struggle with their English and are afraid to dive into the details. Red flag. Next, we're going to look at canned, memorized phrases. Again, I invite you to listen to the question, listen to the answer, and form your own conclusions on the suitability. Tell me about a challenge you faced at work and how you solved it.
In my previous job, I worked on a project. It was successful.
Oh, oh dear. It sounds like they practiced that same line 5 times in front of the mirror at least. Be cautious with too perfect or mechanical sounding answers. Red flag. And finally, let's look at situations where somebody's not really answering the question. For the final time, listen to the example question and the candidate response. What's gone wrong here? Can you give an example of managing customer complaints?
Yes, I speak with clients.
Oh dear. If their answer barely aligns with your question, it's probably because they weren't proficient enough to follow along in the first place. Red flag. Yikes. Not a great start there. But don't worry, you can dig a little deeper to really test their fluency. Let's take a look. Here's how you can check for real understanding using probing questions. Consider the following. Could you give me a bit more detail on that? What was your part in the project? How did you handle communicating X with your team? These types of questions require candidates to explain things in more depth, and you'll quickly see whether they can manage to do that in English or not. Okay, let's make this a little bit clearer. Let's take a look at a realistic scenario that you might encounter as a HR director interviewing someone in English. Picture the scene. You're interviewing a candidate for an IT role and ask the following. Tell me about the time that you dealt with a system failure and how you resolved it.
Well, in my last role, we had a network outage. I communicated with the team to set up a backup and investigated the cause, eventually fixing it in about 2 hours.
You see, that's what you want. Specific details, coherent flow, and professional language. Phew, I think we can all agree that that was somewhat of an improvement because it's real English, real stories. That produces real fluency. When somebody's speaking from the heart, as I always tell my students to do, that's when you really get to see the measure of their true expression in any language. So we've got a solid answer from the candidates. That's great. But I say we can take it a step further. So here are a few follow-up questions to get more insights and really test their English fluency. What would you have done differently if this issue had lasted longer than expected? How did you communicate the situation to the rest of the company? What did you do to avoid similar issues in the future? What role did others play during this process, and how did you coordinate this with them? These kinds of follow-up questions reveal not just the technical skills and aptitudes of the potential employee, which is obviously useful for the position, but it also demonstrates how well they can adapt and collaborate. Plus, it encourages more detailed, natural language use, which is what we want. After all, this isn't an interview situation that they're going to be in every day. They need to be able to deal with the day-to-day use of English. And hopefully these questions will help reveal their competence at that. Well, that's it for today's first lesson. Remember, structure your interviews. Watch out for those red flags, and don't be afraid to dig a little deeper with probing questions. This will help you spot a candidate's real, actual proficiency above what's just written on the CV. And this is setting both you and your company up for success. As HR directors, it's your responsibility and within your power to bring in the top talent. And conducting interviews effectively in English gives you a major advantage. Make sure to download our HR interview planner in English. It includes all the key phrases, the probing questions, and the interview structure tips that we covered today, so you can have it all in one convenient, handy guide. And don't forget, if you have any questions or feedback, hop over to our LinkedIn page, the link is below, And remember, we're here to help. So keep the conversation going and ask away. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video where we'll be diving into essential recruitment vocabulary. So take care for now and happy interviewing.